What started as a calm television interview slowly turned into one of the most intense and unforgettable moments in live broadcast history. The studio lights were bright. The audience was relaxed. Everyone expected a respectful conversation. Nothing more. Jonathan Roumie, widely known for portraying Jesus in The Chosen, sat composed, hands folded, his expression peaceful. Across from him sat Dr. Phil, confident and sharp, a man famous for asking the questions others avoid. At first, the discussion felt safe, thoughtful, even polite. Then Dr. Phil leaned forward and asked a question that instantly changed the atmosphere. Is faith something that truly guides people, or something they hide behind when life gets too painful? The room froze. You could feel the shift, like a sudden drop in temperature. Audience members stopped breathing. The host glanced nervously between the two men. This was no longer a surface-level discussion. This was personal. Jonathan didn't respond immediately. For a long moment, he simply looked down, as if weighing something heavy in his heart. Cameras zoomed in. Producers whispered behind the scenes. Millions watching at home leaned closer to their screens. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't rehearsed. And whatever came next couldn't be taken back. Dr. Phil continued, pressing gently but firmly. People often turn to faith when they're broken. But is that belief, or is it desperation? The question wasn't cruel, but it was sharp, honest, and dangerous. Jonathan slowly looked up. His eyes weren't defensive. They were reflective, almost wounded. You're asking the right question, he finally said. But you might not be ready for the answer. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. In that moment, it became clear. This wasn't a debate about religion anymore. It was a collision between two worldviews, logic versus surrender, analysis versus experience, doubt versus hope. No one expected what Jonathan would reveal next. Not the audience. Not the producers. Not even Dr. Phil himself. Because behind the calm voice and gentle smile was a story no one had heard before. A story of doubt, silence, and a faith tested to its breaking point. And once that story began, there was no turning back. The stage looked calm, but beneath the polished floor and studio lights, something heavy was forming. Jonathan Roumie sat quietly in his chair, shoulders relaxed, posture steady. To the audience, he looked completely at ease, the same gentle presence millions had come to associate with his portrayal of Jesus in The Chosen. But those who watched closely noticed the small details, the slow breath before he spoke, the way his fingers rested together, the long pauses that suggested he chose words carefully, not for effect, but for honesty. Across from him sat Dr. Phil. Decades of television had trained him to read people faster than they could read themselves. He wasn't aggressive. He didn't need to be. His strength was precision, a way of asking questions that peeled away comfort without raising his voice. Tonight, he wasn't there to challenge Jonathan as an actor. He wasn't interested in ratings or applause. He was interested in belief. The host opened the segment with an easy smile, welcoming viewers at home and briefly summarizing Jonathan's career. The audience clapped warmly. Clips from The Chosen flashed across the screen, Jonathan delivering iconic lines, eyes filled with compassion, voice steady and calm. For a moment, it felt celebratory. But Dr. Phil didn't look at the screen. He watched Jonathan. When the applause faded, Dr. Phil spoke in a measured tone. Jonathan, millions of people see you as a symbol of faith now. Some even say your performance strengthened their belief. That's a powerful responsibility. Jonathan nodded slowly. I don't take that lightly, he said. I never have. The exchange felt respectful, almost gentle. But there was an undercurrent, like calm water hiding a deep current beneath. Dr. Phil continued. You didn't grow up famous. You didn't grow up certain. Your journey wasn't easy. Jonathan's expression changed, not dramatically, just enough. No, he said quietly. It wasn't. The audience leaned in. Dr. Phil paused, then asked, So when you talk about faith now, are you speaking from belief, or from experience? The question hung in the air longer than expected. Jonathan smiled faintly, but it wasn't the kind of smile meant for cameras. It was the smile of someone recognizing an old door, one they hadn't planned on opening. Those two aren't separate for me, Jonathan replied. Not anymore. Dr. Phil nodded, but he wasn't satisfied. Most people don't reach faith through clarity, he said. They reach it through crisis. There it was, the first crack. Jonathan shifted slightly in his seat. He didn't interrupt. He listened. Dr. Phil continued, careful but firm. I've spent my career talking to people at their lowest point. And I've seen how belief can be a comfort, but also an escape. A few audience members shifted uncomfortably. Jonathan took a breath. Faith doesn't remove pain, he said. It teaches you how to stand inside it. The response was calm, but it carried weight. Dr. Phil raised an eyebrow. Or, he said, it gives pain a story so people don't have to face the chaos underneath. The tension rose, not loudly, but undeniably. The host glanced toward the producers. The red live light was still on. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out at the audience, at strangers who felt familiar. People who had come for conversation and found themselves standing at the edge of something much deeper. When people see me on screen, Jonathan finally said, they assume certainty, strength, direction. He paused. But before this role, I was lost. The word landed softly, and yet it echoed. Dr. Phil leaned back slightly, surprised. Jonathan continued, voice steady but quieter now. I had years where nothing worked. No career breakthrough. No clear sign. Just silence. The audience was completely still. I didn't find faith because life was good, Jonathan said. I found it because I didn't know how to survive without it. For the first time, Dr. Phil didn't interrupt. This was no longer an interview. It was a confession forming in real time. And everyone in that studio could feel it. Because whatever Jonathan was about to share next wasn't meant to defend belief. It was meant to explain why he almost lost it. The silence that followed Jonathan's last words felt heavier than noise. I found faith because I didn't know how to survive without it. Those words hung in the air, unpolished and raw. For a moment, no one moved. Not the audience. Not the host. Not even the camera operators, whose lenses stayed fixed on Jonathan's face as if afraid to miss something fragile. Dr. Phil was the first to break the stillness. That's honest, he said slowly. But honesty doesn't make something true. The shift was immediate. Jonathan turned slightly in his chair, fully facing him now. The calm was still there, but it was different. Focused. Grounded. Like someone who had stopped retreating. Dr. Phil continued, his voice firm but not loud. When people reach faith at their lowest point, I have to ask, are they choosing belief or are they choosing relief? A murmur rippled through the audience. Jonathan didn't react right away. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. I didn't choose faith because it was comfortable, he said. I chose it because everything else failed. Dr. Phil nodded, but pressed harder. Or because it gave meaning to suffering that otherwise felt unbearable. The words were clinical, almost surgical. Faith can be powerful, Dr. Phil continued. But it can also be a psychological framework, a way to organize pain so it feels less random. Jonathan leaned forward now. You're describing coping, he said. Not faith. The room tightened. Dr. Phil raised an eyebrow. And what's the difference? Jonathan answered without hesitation. Coping numbs. Faith transforms. A few people in the audience gasped softly. Dr. Phil crossed his arms. That's a belief statement, he said. Not a measurable one. Jonathan nodded. Not everything that matters can be measured. The tension sharpened. Dr. Phil leaned in. Belief becomes dangerous, he said, when people stop questioning it. Jonathan met his gaze. Faith dies when people stop living it. The exchange was no longer theoretical. Dr. Phil shifted direction. You play a figure people worship, he said. That gives you influence, whether you want it or not. Are you comfortable guiding people toward belief when you can't prove it's real? Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly. I'm not guiding anyone toward belief, he said. I'm telling the truth about my experience. Dr. Phil countered immediately. Experience isn't evidence. Jonathan's voice remained steady. Neither is logic when it ignores the human heart. The audience stirred. Some nodded. Others frowned. The divide was visible now. Dr. Phil stood slightly in his seat, intensity rising. I've watched people use faith to avoid responsibility, to wait for miracles instead of making change. Jonathan didn't deny it. That happens, he said. But misuse doesn't cancel truth. Dr. Phil shook his head. Truth has standards. Jonathan looked at him, not defensively, but with something close to sorrow. So does healing, he said. For a moment, Dr. Phil seemed caught off guard. Jonathan continued, voice quieter but stronger. You ask if faith is real because you've seen people break. I believe faith is real because I was broken, and didn't stay that way. The room fell silent again. Dr. Phil exhaled slowly. And what if someone doesn't heal? He asked. What if faith fails them? Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He swallowed. Then faith isn't a guarantee, he said. It's a relationship. The words landed deep. Dr. Phil leaned back, studying him. Relationships fail. Jonathan nodded. Yes, he said. But they also change people. The cameras caught Dr. Phil pausing longer than usual. For the first time, his questions slowed. Because the debate had reached its edge, not of volume, but of vulnerability. Logic had been pushed as far as it could go. And something deeper was waiting to speak. The room no longer felt like a television studio. Something invisible had settled over it, a quiet pressure that made every breath feel deliberate. The debate had burned hot, but now it slowed, like embers glowing beneath the surface. This was the moment where arguments usually repeat themselves, where people harden their positions and wait for applause. But that didn't happen. Dr. Phil broke the silence, his voice lower than before. You speak about faith like it saved you, he said. But I'm still not hearing what it cost you. The question landed differently. Jonathan didn't answer right away. His gaze dropped to the floor. For the first time since the conversation began, he looked unsure, not of belief, but of whether he was ready to go where the question was leading. 'Cause that word opened doors people spend lifetimes keeping shut. Jonathan inhaled slowly, then exhaled. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, not with tears, but with memory. It cost me who I thought I was, he said quietly. The audience leaned forward as one. For years, Jonathan continued, I believed success would justify me. That if I worked hard enough, believed enough, stayed patient enough, something would eventually prove my worth. Dr. Phil didn't interrupt. But the silence kept coming, Jonathan said. Auditions passed. Doors closed. People stopped calling. And every time someone asked how I was doing, I said, fine. A soft, knowing murmur passed through the crowd. Jonathan swallowed. Faith didn't arrive like a miracle, he said. It arrived like surrender. Dr. Phil tilted his head slightly. Surrender to what? He asked. Jonathan paused. To the possibility that I wasn't in control, he said. And never had been. That admission changed the air. He continued, voice steady but fragile. I had prayed before. I had believed before. But this was different. This wasn't asking for success. It was asking not to disappear. The audience was completely still now. There were nights, Jonathan said, when I sat alone and wondered if my life would ever make sense. Not dramatically, just quietly, like a slow fading. Dr. Phil's expression softened. Jonathan looked at him directly. You asked what faith cost me, he said. It cost me my pride, my timeline, my certainty. He paused. And it gave me nothing I could control. The honesty hit harder than any argument. Dr. Phil nodded slowly. That's terrifying, he said. Jonathan smiled faintly. Yes, he replied. It is. For the first time, the two men were no longer debating. They were standing on the same human ground. Dr. Phil leaned back, his voice thoughtful. You know, he said, most people come to me because something in their life stopped working. And they're desperate to regain control. Jonathan nodded. I know. Dr. Phil continued. And the hardest thing for them to accept is that control isn't the answer. Jonathan's eyes met his. "That's where faith lives," he said softly. "Not in answers, but in trust." The host shifted in their chair, sensing the shift. This was no longer about belief systems. It was about vulnerability. Dr. Phil exhaled. "You're saying faith didn't fix your life," he said. "It changed how you carried it." Jonathan smiled, this time fully. "Yes," he said. "Exactly." The audience broke into quiet applause, not loud or celebratory, but respectful, like acknowledgement. Dr. Phil held up a hand gently, signaling for silence. "One more thing," he said. Jonathan nodded. "Do you ever doubt?" Dr. Phil asked. Jonathan didn't hesitate. "All the time," he said. A few gasps echoed. "But doubt doesn't scare me anymore," Jonathan continued. "Because it means I'm still honest." Dr. Phil smiled slightly. "That," he said, "might be the most rational thing you've said tonight." Laughter rippled through the room, easing the tension without breaking the moment. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, visibly lighter. The argument hadn't been won. But something far more important had happened. The debate had turned into understanding. And for the first time that night, both men realized they weren't standing on opposite sides of truth. They were approaching it from different directions. The applause faded, but the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Dr. Phil looked at Jonathan for a long moment, not as a host or challenger, but as someone recognizing a door that had just cracked open. He had spent decades watching people circle around their truths without ever stepping inside them. This time felt different. "Jonathan," he said slowly, "there's something you haven't said yet." The audience stirred. Jonathan's breath caught slightly. His shoulders rose, then fell, as if he were steadying himself for something he hadn't planned to share. The cameras closed in. Producers glanced nervously at one another. This was live television, and no one knew where this moment might go. "I didn't come here planning to say this," Jonathan said. His voice wasn't shaky, but it carried weight. "Before The Chosen," he continued, "before anyone knew my name, I was close to walking away from everything." The room froze. "Not just acting," Jonathan clarified. "Life." A sharp intake of breath echoed from the audience. Dr. Phil's expression changed instantly. Jonathan went on, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the lights. "I felt invisible," he said. "Not ignored, invisible. Like I could disappear and nothing would shift." The honesty was almost unbearable. "There were days I questioned whether I had misunderstood my purpose completely," Jonathan said. "Whether I had mistaken hope for delusion." Dr. Phil leaned forward, carefully. "What stopped you?" he asked. Jonathan swallowed. "Nothing dramatic," he said. "No voice. No sign." He paused. "Just exhaustion." The audience remained utterly still. "I was tired of fighting myself," Jonathan continued. "Tired of measuring my worth by results I couldn't control. Tired of trying to earn meaning." His voice softened. "So one night, I stopped asking for answers, and asked for help." A hush settled over the studio. "And that's when something changed," Jonathan said. "Not around me, inside me." Dr. Phil nodded slowly. Jonathan continued. "I realized faith wasn't about being chosen. It was about choosing to stay." A few tears appeared in the eyes of audience members. Dr. Phil took a breath. "That's not a religious statement," he said quietly. "That's a survival one." Jonathan smiled faintly. "But here's the part I've never said out loud," Jonathan added. The tension returned. 4 years after that moment, he said, nothing improved. No roles. No recognition. No breakthrough. Dr. Phil's eyebrows lifted slightly. "I kept praying," Jonathan said. "But I also kept failing." The word echoed. "And I learned something uncomfortable," he continued. "Faith doesn't promise progress. It promises presence." Dr. Phil sat back, visibly moved. Jonathan looked directly at him. "You asked earlier if faith is belief or desperation," he said. "For me, it was honesty." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. "I stopped pretending I was strong," Jonathan said. "And that's when strength found me." Dr. Phil exhaled deeply. "You know," he said, "most people wait their entire lives to say what you just said, and never do." Jonathan nodded. "I know," he replied. "That's why I had to say it now." The host glanced toward the camera, unsure whether to interrupt. They didn't. Jonathan concluded softly. "If playing Jesus taught me anything," he said, "it's that faith isn't about being perfect. It's about staying when leaving feels easier." The studio erupted into quiet, emotional applause. Not for a performance, but for truth. Dr. Phil stood slightly in his seat and extended his hand. Jonathan took it. In that moment, the debate ended, not because one side won, but because something real had been spoken aloud. And everyone watching knew they had just witnessed something rare. A conversation that changed the people inside it. The applause slowly faded, but something had permanently shifted in the room. Dr. Phil released Jonathan's hand and sat back down, quieter than before. The confident posture that usually defined him was still there, but softened, less armored. This was no longer a stage for debate. It had become a space for reflection. Dr. Phil cleared his throat. "You know," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I've spent my career challenging people to take responsibility for their lives. To stop waiting for answers and start making changes." Jonathan nodded, listening. "But what you just described," Dr. Phil continued, "isn't avoidance. It's acceptance. And those are not the same thing." The audience responded with a low murmur of agreement. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "Faith didn't replace responsibility for me," he said. "It made me face it." Dr. Phil smiled faintly. "That's an important distinction," he said. The host gently stepped back into the conversation, sensing the moment had reached a natural turning point. "This has clearly struck a chord," they said, glancing toward the audience. "I think a lot of people see themselves in what you've both shared." Jonathan looked out across the room. "I hope so," he said quietly. "Because loneliness convinces us we're the only ones failing." Dr. Phil nodded. "And that belief," he added, "is one of the most destructive there is." The camera cut briefly to audience members, some wiping their eyes, others sitting with arms crossed, thoughtful rather than defensive. The show had started with questions about belief, but it was ending with something far more universal: the human need to be seen. Dr. Phil turned back to Jonathan. "Let me ask you something," he said. "If the chosen had never happened, if that door had stayed closed, would your faith still stand?" Jonathan didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. The certainty in his voice wasn't loud. "It didn't need to be. Because my faith isn't built on outcomes," Jonathan continued. "It's built on survival. I didn't believe so I could succeed. I believed so I could stay." Dr. Phil exhaled slowly. "That's a powerful answer," he said. "And not one people hear often." The host glanced at the clock, signaling the segment was nearing its end. Dr. Phil offered a final thought. "I may question belief systems," he said, "but I don't question honesty. And what you shared tonight was honest." Jonathan smiled, grateful but composed. "Thank you," he said. "That means more than agreement." The two men shared a brief nod, not of victory or defeat, but of mutual respect. As the segment wrapped, the audience rose to its feet. Not in explosive applause, but in something deeper, recognition. The kind reserved for moments that feel personal, even when shared publicly. Jonathan stood, slightly overwhelmed. As the cameras pulled back, Dr. Phil added one final line, almost under his breath but picked up clearly by the microphones. "Sometimes the strongest thing a person can say is, 'I stayed.'" Jonathan paused, then turned back. "Yes," he said. "And sometimes that's enough." The red live light dimmed. But the conversation didn't end there. Backstage, staff members approached quietly, thanking Jonathan. A few admitted they hadn't expected the discussion to hit so close to home. One producer wiped their eyes and said, "People needed that." Jonathan simply nodded. Faith hadn't been proven. Logic hadn't been defeated. But something more important had happened. Two different worldviews had met, not to conquer, but to understand. And for everyone watching, the resolution was clear. You don't have to agree to respect. You don't have to believe the same way to believe someone's story. And sometimes, healing doesn't come from answers. It comes from being heard. When the lights dimmed and the cameras stopped rolling, something remained in the air, something no broadcast schedule could cut short. What had begun as a debate about faith ended as a reminder of humanity. Not because anyone won. Not because minds were changed overnight. But because truth had been spoken without armor. Jonathan Roumie and Dr. Phil didn't walk away agreeing on belief. And that was never the point. What mattered was what happened in the space between certainty and doubt, the place where most people actually live. Faith, as the conversation revealed, is not a slogan or a shield. It's not a guarantee of success, comfort, or answers. For some, it's belief. For others, it's endurance. And for many, it's simply the reason they choose not to give up when silence feels louder than hope. Dr. Phil's questions represented logic, responsibility, and skepticism, tools the modern world values deeply. Jonathan's answers represented vulnerability, surrender, and trust, qualities often misunderstood as weakness. But by the end of the conversation, it was clear that neither side was incomplete. They were complementary. Logic helps us ask the right questions. Faith helps us survive when there are no answers. And somewhere between the two lies wisdom. Jonathan's revelation didn't inspire because it was religious. It inspired because it was honest. Millions of people watching didn't see a famous actor or a television personality. They saw themselves, tired, uncertain, questioning their worth, wondering if staying is enough. And that's the real message. You don't have to have everything figured out. You don't have to be unshaken. You don't even have to be certain. You just have to be willing to stay. Stay when progress feels slow. Stay when silence answers your prayers. Stay when the version of success you imagined never arrives. Because staying is not weakness. It's courage without applause. The conversation reminded us that respect doesn't require agreement. It requires listening. And in a world addicted to winning arguments, listening has become revolutionary. Jonathan didn't defend faith by quoting scripture. Dr. Phil didn't dismantle belief with statistics. Instead, they met as two human beings willing to acknowledge pain, and that alone changed the tone of everything. That is the power of real dialogue. Not to convince, but to connect. As viewers, we were reminded of something simple yet profound. Everyone is carrying something invisible. The person questioning belief may be searching for peace. The person holding on to faith may be fighting to survive another day. Neither deserves judgment. Both deserve understanding. And maybe that's why the moment felt so rare. Because humility is rare. Honesty is rare. And conversations that don't end in division are rarer still. The final takeaway wasn't about faith versus logic. It was about truth versus performance. And truth doesn't shout. It doesn't rush. It waits patiently for someone brave enough to speak it. If there is a lesson to carry forward, it's this. Respect people before you understand them. Listen before you label them. And never assume strength looks the way you expect it to. Sometimes strength looks like doubt. Sometimes faith looks like exhaustion. Sometimes courage looks like simply saying, I stayed. And if you're reading this and finding yourself in that space, uncertain, tired, holding on quietly, know this. You're not weak. You're not behind. You're human. And sometimes, staying is the strongest act of faith there is. If this story resonated with you, type "stay" in the comments. Not as a declaration of belief, but as a reminder to yourself. You're still here. And that matters.